webinar. And a very warm welcome from the capital here in Tshwane. My name is Musiri Mokhele, representing the National Press Club in my capacity as the Head of Public Relations and Stakeholder Relations. We are delighted once more to be partnering with SAHPRA in bringing South Africans from all corners yet another educational webinar where we'll be focusing on the process of vaccine approval webinar. I have three speakers on the panel who will help us to dissect this topic further. And they are Dr. Boitumelo Semete Makokotlela, who is the Chief Executive Officer at SAHPRA. I also have Professor Marc, who is the Professor at the Department of Internal Medicine. And last but not least, I have Professor Helen Rees, who is the Board Chairperson at SAHPRA. Before I hand over to the three speakers to briefly introduce themselves and make their opening remarks, I would like to remind our colleagues, especially from media, that throughout our conversation, we encourage them to pose their questions in the chat box. And when we do get to a point where we are able to attend to questions and answer sessions, we will then be able to tackle their questions. At this point in time, I would like to invite Dr. Boitumelo Semete Makokotlela, if she can tell us a little bit about herself, but also help us with her opening remarks in as far as today's topic is concerned.
Good morning. Thank you, Musidi, for facilitating, and thank you for partnering with us and giving us this opportunity to share with the public on this very important topic that speaks to how the regulator makes the decisions on vaccine approvals. My name is Boitumelo Semete, as already indicated, and I have a PhD in biochemistry as well as a master's in finance and investment. But today we'll be talking largely around the vaccine approval process. So just to maybe educate the public, as a regulator, our mandate is to ensure that all health products comply with safety principles with regulatory principles of safety, quality, as well as efficacy. And this applies to the entire spectrum of health products, that is medical devices, which are also under our mandate. It refers to complementary medicines, veterinary, as well as human medicines. In response to COVID, as a regulator, we made a decision that has been communicated also to industry that all COVID-related applications, whether it's for medical devices as well as IVDs, whether it's for PPE, and now vaccines and medicines, will be expedited. So we've dedicated quite a significant amount of our team members and our resources to tackle this area of vaccines. When it comes to vaccine regulation, we have expedited the process, and we've included various mechanisms to also ensure that as information becomes available, the applicants can make the submissions to us and provide us with data. So we've got two mechanisms in essence for vaccine review. The first is where all the information is available and it's made to us, and we review that information, and we constantly engage with the applicant. The second one is what we call a rolling review, wherein the applicant makes a submission to us, and as their data becomes available, they submit this to SAHPRA. This is to ensure that we don't have to wait for the full package of information to be available for us to commence an evaluation process. When we review vaccines, we look at the three elements of safety, quality, and efficacy. When it comes to quality, we look at, has this product been manufactured in a mechanism that complies with good manufacturing practices? We work with other regulators who would conduct inspections at the site, or if the site is in South Africa, we would conduct the inspections ourselves, and other regulators would rely on a decision that we make. So the data around the quality of the manufacturing process, compliance to good manufacturing practices, is important to us. Secondly, we look at the safety of the product. This is where we look at preclinical as well as clinical data that has been collected from phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical studies. In this case, we look at, has the product led to any adverse effects? And are these adverse effects associated to the vaccine itself, or are these expected adverse effects that can then be managed? We've got different categories of adverse effects. This could be adverse effects following immunization or adverse effects of special interest. And so as a regulator, we look at where those picked up during a clinical trial, and we then make a determination of how these are managed after that. Then the third element we look at is efficacy. Does this product do what it claims to do? And in this case, do these vaccines address, and as indicated earlier, when it comes to vaccines, these are not treatments. So vaccines, you can take a vaccine, however, you may still be infected. But what vaccines do is they manage whether you can get a disease or not. So it manages the severity of the diseases, and that's the role of vaccines. And so we look at its efficacy in limiting disease severity. And Prof. Blockman will also speak to that. So those are the elements that we look at. And our work doesn't only stop once the product has been registered. We also follow the product throughout its life cycle. So when it comes to these vaccines, we continuously monitor these. After they've been authorized, we monitor them from an efficacy perspective. In our context, we're looking at efficacy data as they're being rolled out against the beta variant and any other prevalent variants of concern. We also look at the adverse side effects that may be as a result of having received the vaccine. And for this, we've got a Med Safety app that we've made available, and we're already receiving reports from that. I will pause here for now. Thank you, Ms. CD.
Thank you, Dr. Widumelo Simete Makokotlela. That was quite a mouthful. Actually, I'm reminded of the fact that a year ago, many of us knew very little about SAHPRA or what SAHPRA does, but a year on, topics such as vaccine and regulation when it comes to vaccines in particular have become part of our vocabulary. At this point in time, I'd like to hand over to Professor Marc Blockman, who is the professor at the Department of Internal Medicine. Prof, over to you.
Everybody, and thank you very much for the invite. Just to say that I'm a physician at Critical Hospital, University of Cape Town, and clinical pharmacology, and I chair the pharmacovigilance committee of SAHPRA. And I may not take the full 15 minutes, but maybe just give a couple of broad-based discussionary items around how we look at the evidence for vaccine approval, and importantly, the safety aspects of that. And so to say that we are very strongly committed to safety and efficacy. And as the CEO suggested, this is a prophylactic vaccine, and so we need to take care not only of efficacy, but the safety aspects as well, because we're not treating a disease process, but we are trying to prevent that disease process. Importantly is that you need a team of experts and a team of people around who have different expertise to be able to look at all the aspects of safety and efficacy. It certainly cannot be done by one group and one type of expert. It requires people who understand vaccines themselves. It requires people who understand the efficacy data and what a hard outcome endpoint would be. So, for example, hospitalization, somebody going into ICU, or obviously mortality. And then it requires people who understand the makeup of the vaccine as well, from a good manufacturing practice, that the vaccine itself satisfies good quality control. And then importantly, the aspects around safety. And then once it's being provided to the population, the kind of post-regulatory safety commitment. And so if I just step back and look at effectiveness, one must remember that we're not in a space alone. We occupy space internationally. And so what we do is we rely not only what is put in front of us in terms of a rolling dossier or a dossier of data which we would look to analyze, but also we rely on what other regulatory environments have suggested, as well as, for example, the WHO, and take all of these into consideration when making a decision on the safety and effectiveness of medicine, but also on a vaccine in this situation. And importantly, we rely a lot on published data, but also on the unpublished data. The nice aspects about published data, and especially in the vaccine space, you'll note that there's been a lot published. There's a lot of turnover in terms of clinical trials and publication, is that the benefit is that there's peer review. And what that means, it gives academics and gives clinicians an opportunity to look at the data, make a commentary on the data, but also it has an honesty attached to it, because peer review and open up to scrutiny allows everybody to have a look and say, well, is this a true effect or is this not a true effect? And that is really useful in terms of our process of looking at especially the efficacy, but also the safety aspects of vaccines. Importantly is that when you do clinical trials, it's not massive numbers of people that are often enrolled into clinical trials. And so what that means is that the rare adverse events that we will look for after the fact are not always found in the clinical trial population. That does not mean to say that it's not safe, because that's people say, oh my gosh, that means that there are risks out there that we're really worried about. That's not the case, because if we take a step back, one doesn't go into a population until you really understand what this vaccine may or may not do. And so there'll be some animal data, which one would look to see if there are signals of harm. One would also have biological data that occurs within test tubes to understand if this vaccine may or may not have the efficacy we require, but also the harms the predictable harms that we look at, and then obviously the different phases of the vaccine development, despite the fact being accelerated, will add different populations, which will give us an understanding of the safety. So it's not done in isolation. But what is important is that there's this commitment post-regulatory approval to make sure that there's a requirement and information gathering around, one, is it doing what it needs to do? And importantly, the CEO mentioned what we'd like from vaccines to do is one aspect is to prevent transmission of the virus, and then sometimes that's a little bit more difficult, and some of them are showing that. But importantly is to prevent severe infection requiring hospitalization, and in our sector, high flow nasal oxygen and ICU admission. And what we are trying to do with vaccines is to prevent that severity, the very severe illness, which one is terrible for the patient, but two is obviously for the healthcare environment as well, because there's a look to burdening of or the requirement for having beds in our overpressed hospital environment. We're trying to prevent people actually coming into hospital, which is a very important outcome of this of the public and the population vaccine. So what do we look for? Well, COVID-19 is a new disorder, and so one had to decide what one would think of in terms of what the efficacy outcomes would be, and these were established internationally, and we collaborate in that manner and kind of agree on what the principles of efficacy and what an effective vaccine should look like. Similarly, for adverse event monitoring and for what we think is a risk more than a benefit in terms of the vaccine. And these have international flavor, and we subscribe to that, which is very useful, because it means that we are all speaking with the same language, and I like that. Because what that means is that if there's an efficacy signal, that means that's similar in the various populations, and it's consistent, and we can use that information for our own regulatory approval. And if there's a safety signal, we can also, because it's the same language and people are saying using the same words to describe it, we can say, well, that we understand that, and we can use other people's experiences, other regulatory experiences, published experiences, for us to build this picture around vaccine efficacy as well as vaccine safety. And just to talk a little bit about the safety aspects is that it's an ongoing collaboration. One is obviously with regulators that we align ourselves with. If they pick up signals, it's shared, and we look at them very hard to see if it's causal or not causal. But there's a dedicated environment within SAHPRA, pharmacovigilance, a drug safety environment that looks critically at the safety. We put accountability on the manufacturers to make sure that they are providing us with that information. And also, importantly, there's been training of healthcare workers across the board to be able to recognize adverse events as well, and then to report them to us. So in a timeliest fashion, one can look critically at these adverse events and decide if it changes the benefit-risk ratio of the vaccine. Importantly, there's an app, and that most people are digitally minded, and so the app allows ease of access and ease of ability to actually provide that information to SAHPRA. There's also a group, and I'll stop now, which is a group looking at adverse events following immunization, and that's been going on for quite a while. We see vaccination for COVID in isolation, but we've been vaccinating populations for a very long time. So we have some understanding of the risk-benefit and also the signals that we'd be looking out for. And there's this group, the AFI group, which help look at these signals, provide that information to us, allow us to think this through, and then provide a recommendation if the risks risks outweigh the benefit, or the benefit continues to outweigh the risks. And the last thing is that there's a commitment from manufacturers to provide a risk management plan. And that means for safety signals that we think haven't been well elucidated, that there's a commitment that they will either do further studies, or there'd be a dedicated review of that risk. And that will be provided very urgently to SAHPRA, so SAHPRA can make regular calls, again, on the benefit-risk ratio of the vaccine. And importantly, it's a collaboration. And the Sisonke rollout gave us some, and it was very useful because it was an implementation study. And what it allowed is us, one, to develop a relationship, which we do have already, but a relationship, again, with the academic environment, the groups of colleagues that are either doing vaccine research or vaccinating, but also gave us a good understanding about some of the risks of vaccination, the processes that we've put in place to see the robustness and the effectiveness of those processes. And I think that held up very well. And so we move forward from a very strong platform of risk-benefit assessment. I leave it at that for a moment. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Prof. Marc Blockman, for that insightful opening remarks. At this point, I would like to hand over to the board chairperson of SAHPRA, Professor Helen Rees, for her opening remarks. And before I hand over to her, I would just like to remind our media colleagues in particular, I see that we've logged on in numbers. However, I'm not picking up any questions yet. So please do not hesitate to post your questions in the chat box. And then as soon as Professor Helen Rees is done with her address, we'll be able to tackle some of your questions. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Masidi. And welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for coming on. And I'm going to share with you something that came out from the board last night. And this is one of the reasons we're hoping to sort of really do more of these sort of dialogues. And that is that I think that we recognize that we haven't been very good at communicating as a regulatory authority. For the very well-resourced regulatory authorities, for example, for the UK, for the European Union, they have enormous resources around communication, because communication is just so important when you're trying to explain things that are quite technical and that aren't necessarily intuitive. They're not quite obvious why people are doing what they're doing. So we're delighted to work with the press club, and we'd be very happy if you, as journalists, also went through the press club and said, "Listen, here's a hot topic. Can we have a briefing?" So I think we really want to open up a dialogue, and we want to sort of grow that side of SAHPRA. So that's the first thing. I was meant to introduce myself, and I apologize. My name's Helen Rees, and I'm at Wits University, the chair of the board. But I also have worked, we're talking about vaccines today. I've worked for many years with the World Health Organization, with the region, the African region, with a group called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, and with Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine Innovation, and now with COVAX. So I do a lot of global work as well around vaccines. So if there are any queries or questions about that, I would also be happy to answer those. So just to come back and to sort of complement what's been said. And Masidi, you said, and you're quite right, if we'd taken 18 months ago, most people would have just said, SAHPRA, sounds a bit dull, drug regulation. It sounds like just people behind the scenes who are administrators and bureaucratic and wave a stick from time to time. And many people in the public wouldn't have insight into why it's so important. But one of the reasons why drug regulation is so important, and South Africa, we are lucky and we want to hang on to this, is although the Medicines Control Council, that was the predecessor to SAHPRA, was by no means perfect. And as I think you all know, we inherited a big backlog because of the way of doing business historically and the way it was structured. SAHPRA was intended to be restructured both from a legislative point of view, a regulatory point of view, and also just in terms of changing the way of doing business. And that's been the ambition of SAHPRA since it was started. And remember, we're only about 3.5 years. So the regulator is an incredibly important body, and I think we should see it as a critical pillar of an effective health service. If you don't have a strong regulatory authority, what it means is that you will not be able to have confidence in health products. And if you think about yourself going in for an anesthetic or taking your child to the doctor for an antibiotic, or being on oncology drugs for a cancer, or being on antiretrovirals if you're living with HIV, etc., you want to be sure that those drugs are what they say they are, and that they're going to work in the way that they say they will work, that you understand any side effect profile. Many drugs have side effect profiles, and that you'll understand that, you'll know what to look out for, and that, if you are giving this to members of the family, that you know that they're going to work. And from a community point of view, if you think about vaccines, we really do, because we're giving it, as Tumi said, we're giving it to healthy people, often to children, but let's put COVID to one side. Most of our vaccines are given to children, and often very young children. So we want to be really sure that those vaccines are going to do what we say they're going to do, for example, stop measles, that they're going to be safe. Very important when you're giving a vaccine, because you don't want something with a high rate of side effects, and that they're going to be manufactured in a consistent way to high quality, because clearly if they're not, then the effectiveness of that vaccine isn't going to be there. So just to say that we rely on an effective regulator to allow that to happen. There are, unfortunately, many countries who are now trying to develop their regulatory authorities, and we've seen a real improvement in the last 10 years, with many countries really sort of putting a lot of effort into this. But without a regulatory authority in countries that are less well-resourced than South Africa, we not infrequently see substandard medicines, counterfeit medicines, and even dangerous medicines. And a substandard medicine isn't only potentially dangerous because of the contents, the perhaps impurities in the drug, but it's equally dangerous if it says it's got X amount of antibiotic and it doesn't. It has either much more or much less or none at all. That's equally dangerous. So having that assurity about your medicines, your health products is incredibly important. So that's just one thing. But I want to highlight something else, and it really goes around vaccines and something that's happened this week, and why a regulator is so important, and that they have to do their job. I think you all, as journalists, will be aware that the president and the head of WHO, Dr. Tedros, both made a joint announcement about an investment with Department of Science and Innovation here to import technology to develop what are called mRNA vaccines. These are the Pfizer, Moderna type of vaccines. And that technology would allow South Africa to become a vaccine manufacturing center. It wouldn't be the only technology, because we're also seeing J&J, and in the future we would hope to see other technologies, other vaccine technologies manufactured here. But one of the reasons why South Africa was awarded this status to be able to develop this manufacturing practice was when WHO reviewed the applications from countries for this. They actually looked as one of the criteria at the regulatory authority, because you cannot put a manufacturing site for international vaccines into a country that doesn't have strong regulation. I think you're all familiar with what's just happened with the J&J vaccine. This was a manufacturing site in the United States, not a low-resource country, where the contamination of vaccines has meant that many millions of vaccines have had to be destroyed, including in this country. So that the quality and the standards of manufacturing are incredibly important. And part of the reason that South Africa was awarded this mRNA opportunity was because we have a strong regulator. So that's the second thing. And the third thing I would say, and this is also, I think, very, very important, is that the way that the legislation has been developed for SAHPRA means that SAHPRA is independent. And this is seen as global best practice for regulatory authorities. And you're seeing, as I say, in many countries of the world now, this move towards independence and legislation that protects that. And one of the reasons for that is that this is a scientific body, it's a regulatory body, and it must really apply its mind to the science, as both Tumi and Marc have said, but also must look at the public good. So independent, yes. Does it ignore the fact we're in a pandemic? Absolutely not. And the legislation allows the regulator to, for example, have conditional use and fast track things and all sorts of things. The legislation allows that. But what it does say is, while you're doing things urgently in the context of a pandemic, you must do it independently, and you must be driven by science and the public good and the good of patients. And that's what must drive you, nothing else. And that's incredibly important, because that independence is what makes for a good regulatory authority, and it protects everybody. It protects the public, it protects patients, and it protects other people who are coming under pressure to get other drugs registered for all sorts of reasons, because the regulator is meant to be there and say, our job is to look at the science, as Marc has said, and this is how we're going to look at it, and we're going to monitor safety afterwards. But that's our job. So let me stop there, and thanks very much for all your time, and we're open to questions. I do apologize that I will have to jump off slightly early because I have to go to another meeting.
Thank you, Professor Rees. Actually, we are getting quite a lot of questions. I will take 3 or 4 questions per round, then afford our speakers the opportunity to respond, after which we'll take another round. We have until 11 o'clock for this particular webinar, but we do promise that the questions that we cannot get through, particularly during this particular webinar, we will sit down with our colleagues, especially the communications team from SAHPRA, and see if we can perhaps respond to your questions and list them in one of their info sites. The first set of questions that we received is from Kevin Brand, and he is from Eyewitness News. His first question is, people who have been vaccinated are testing positive even after they've been vaccinated. Some people have died. Why is it important that people should be vaccinated still? That's his first question. The second question from Kevin is that, what are the efficacy data of vaccines we are currently rolling out in South Africa? And his last question is that the economic freedom fighters will tomorrow march to your offices seeking approval of vaccines from China and Russia. What is SAHPRA's response in that regard? I'd like to hand over in particular to Dr. Boitumelo Semete Magogotlela and Professor Helen Rees, if she hasn't left us as yet, to perhaps tackle especially the first two questions for us.
Thank you. Can I ask Prof. Rees to take the first question, please? And maybe Prof. Blockman would also want to add to that.
Yeah, and it's a very good question. So I think the first thing, just to remind us all, to remind you what the question was, is essentially we're seeing breakthrough infections with the vaccines that we've got. And it's not only here, I'm sure you've all read the news, Israel is now highly immunized breakthrough infections, Seychelles, highly immunized breakthrough infections. So the list goes on. Many countries that have got quite high levels of immunization are seeing this. And so the question is, why are we still continuing to immunize? Well, the first thing to say is that with a new disease like this, all of these vaccines are brand new. So when you approve them, what you have is you'll have varying degrees of clinical data that tell you how effective the vaccine is likely to be. One of our challenges in South Africa is that there's relatively little clinical data. There is some, and Marc will perhaps want to talk to that. There is some clinical data about how some of the vaccines perform in the context of the beta variant, which is our predominant variant. But it's limited at best. And so we have to go on the cumulative knowledge that we have from laboratory data about antibodies and about the clinical data, and then we introduce it into the field. And one of the things that Marc was saying is with new vaccines, new disease, you're doing what you have on paper, and you're doing the best evaluation you can get, and you introduce it. And you've probably heard a lot of people saying that we're hoping that many of these vaccines, even if they're not that effective at preventing mild to moderate disease, might well prevent more severe disease and hospitalization. And that's what's hoped. We also know that all the vaccines, every single vaccine, has been rendered less effective in the context of the variant, and particularly the beta variant. The beta variant has proved to be one of the toughest variants for a vaccine to beat. I shouldn't have said that. That was terrible. So that's the first thing. But what we are doing is that we are monitoring these breakthrough infections. So we are now looking, and there's a national strategy that's there, is to look at the breakthrough infections and to evaluate them. And the way that they're being evaluated is first to say, has this person had a vaccine? If yes, which vaccine? Secondly, do they have other comorbidities? Who is the person? Are they over 60? Do they have a lot of other risk factors? Thirdly, what is the severity of the disease? Is it mild? Is it moderate? Is it severe? Are they hospitalized? Taking that into account. And increasingly what we're trying to do is also to identify which virus has actually caused this breakthrough infection. Is it the beta variant? Is it a different variant? Which virus has actually caused this infection? And we are going to develop that protocol is now being escalated to be developed as a national protocol, but we're looking at all the vaccines. As we roll out all vaccines, that protocol will apply to look through breakthrough infections. What we can say at the moment is, although we are seeing breakthrough infections, it would appear, if we look at the J&J data, and I've seen some early data, which hasn't been published yet, but what I can share with you is from that data, it does appear that although we are seeing breakthrough infections, many of those infections, it's mild to moderate disease. Then in fact, we are seeing this reduction in severe disease. And that would be true of Pfizer as well. And these are, of course, the two vaccines that we've got. The other thing, of course, that we're also doing is looking around the world at other countries' experiences of vaccines. But because we have the beta variant, and we share it with many other African countries, South Africa is in an unfortunate position, but an important position, is that we can generate this data to look at breakthrough infections in the context of this particular variant. Is it worth having a vaccine? Absolutely. The most important thing we can do is to get vaccines, to roll them out, and to do it as quickly as we can. Because if we can reduce the severity of disease, we're all seeing what's happening in Gauteng with the hospitals at the moment. We can reduce the severity of disease. We take that terrible burden off the hospitals, and we'll reduce the excess mortality that will come with that surge of infections and surge of serious disease. Let me stop there. Thank you. Perhaps, Marc, you want to talk about the effectiveness of the vaccines?
Yes, thank you. So I think I agree 100% with what you've said, Professor Rees. I actually think that the breakthrough infections is a very important aspect, which we have protocols are looking very critically at that. And I think that when one looks at breakthrough infections, one must take it very seriously and look at when the person was vaccinated. Did they have a complete vaccination? At what timeline did they develop the infection? And do we think that the vaccine immunity had reached its peak and was in the protection phase of the vaccine, as well as trying to get the sample from the nasopharyngeal swab that may have been taken to prove that the person was COVID positive, for us to look critically at that virus and see what that virus looks like. Vaccine efficacy for both of the vaccines that we are using at this moment in time is in fact very good. The vaccine efficacy has been shown against our variant, which is obviously very important, and both have shown, which for me is absolutely critical, is 100% efficacy against severe disease. And that means coming into hospitals like myself, my own, and requiring oxygen and worse, requiring high flow and intubation. So we are comfortable at this moment in time that the vaccines that are being rolled out, the two vaccines, are highly effective against serious disease from COVID-19. However, it's a pandemic, and the rollout must occur, and we must continue to accumulate data to make sure that continues to be consistent with what our approval and the data that we had for approval initially was. And we committed to doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. If I can also add to say, while these SAHPRA is also quite involved with the research community in assessing these protocols and making sure that we take into account everything that we're seeing across the globe. So even when we make a decision, we don't only consider data generated from South Africa. We are working with experts, international experts, and we continuously to review the emerging data around this vaccine. And if I can take the last question that was asked about the march that's happening tomorrow, it is a constitutional right for a South African to march. We just hope and we urge the team to comply with COVID-19 protocols, safety, of wearing masks, of social distancing, and complying, because as alluded to, we're seeing the high numbers in Gauteng, and we really need to make sure that through non-pharmaceutical interventions, these are managed. But from us as a regulator, our position is that we make decisions based on the science that is behind every single vaccine. You've heard how detailed it is, the types of data we look at, the detailed reviews that we go through. So our main concern is about the science of these vaccines. We are evaluating the Sinovac vaccine. We're also evaluating the Sputnik vaccine. And as recent as this week, we've now received an application for Sinopharm. So we really are quite busy as an organization. And the only thing we're going to concern ourselves with is science. Because while we understand that this is a pandemic, and we understand, particularly in our context with, the delays that we've had in the vaccination rollout due to some of the matters that were outside of our control as a country. We understand the pressure that we're under, but it is important and it's paramount for us as a regulator that the safety of the public, it takes precedence. So wherever we are of the view that the regulatory requirements are not met, we will not issue an authorization, because we want to ensure that when you do receive a vaccine, you have confidence that this is a vaccine that is safe, that is produced using quality mechanisms, and that it will be effective. And the position that we took around the J&J vaccine should actually give the public confidence that as a regulator, while we are cognizant of the pandemic and the pressures that we're under, wherein we are of the view that the safety of the public will be compromised, we will ensure that we remain independent and we make our decisions based on science, and we will then not authorize what does not comply with the three, very critical pillars. But wherein the products do comply, we will indeed authorize. So we concern ourselves only with science. There isn't anything else really that influences us besides the science that's behind all of these vaccines. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bitumelo and the two professors. I will take the next set of questions. I've got two from Liesel Delange. Liesel Delange is from Rapport. Her first question is, how far along is the process of weighing up Sputnik 5 and Sinovac, and how long might it take to look at Sinovac? And then the next question is from Aisha Abdul Karim. She is from the Bekisisa Center for Health Journalism. And her question is, please can Professor Blockman elaborate a bit more on the review process for efficacy data supplied in the application? How does the committee evaluate efficacy data? And is original data requested from the manufacturers, stroke applicants? And does SAHPRA conduct its own analysis, or does it rely on those supplied by the applicant and shared in publications? The last set of questions that I'm taking for this particular round is also from Liesel Delange from Rapport. And her question is, are we taking note of the rise in infections in the Seychelles, where numbers are rising even though they have vaccinated a large part of their population with Sinopharm and Sputnik 5? And the last part of Liesel's question is, again, are we looking at Sputnik Light, which does not use adenovirus 5, in light of concerns around our HIV plus population? I know I've posed quite a lot of questions. I hope all our speakers have been able to catch the questions. I'll hand over to them to help us respond to these questions.
Thank you. I'm happy to start. So in terms of how long the process takes, it really depends on the quality of the submission. And it depends then on the information that is made available to us and whether it does meet the regulatory requirements. There's constant engagement, with all the applicants around the information that's made available to us. So it is very difficult for us at this point to communicate timelines, because we review what's being made available to us and we may come up with more questions. But as I've indicated earlier, we have, we expedite our processes. I mean, my team is working, throughout 24/7. Even on public holidays, we have met with some of the applicants to ensure that we, apply timeous processes, because we understand the urgency around these vaccines. So, we can commit that when we do have the information, we review it quite speedily. But also the applicant, they would need to respond to our queries speedily. Very important also is that we do indeed look at the data that is made available against the variants of concern, particularly for us in South Africa, where the beta variant is the most prevalent one. It is important that we look at, clinical data or in vitro data on whether the vaccines are effective against the specific variant of concern. So that's one of the considerations that we apply in reviewing the vaccines. In terms of Sputnik, we've received the Sputnik V, which is separate, at 26 and at 5. And we are, as I indicated, considering those for both the Section 21 as well as for a market authorization. I'll have my colleagues maybe address the other questions. Prof. Blockman, do you want to take the question from Aisha?
So thank you for the question. So yes, we try and look at all the data that is available for a particular vaccine, be it safety and efficacy. So not only will we look at data which is put in front of us from the manufacturer, but we will make our own effort to look at anything that's published or recently published. And what that does is that allows us to have as much data as possible when one can then consider the efficacy and the safety at that particular moment for the regulatory approval. So there's the clinical aspect, which then would look at the protection and the adverse events. And then obviously there's the in vitro that's within test tubes in terms of its ability to form antibodies and for those antibodies to kill off the virus as well, those neutralizing antibodies. And so you put both of those together in terms of making a regulatory decision. So we look at all the data put in front of us. We do our own review of the data. We don't do our own studies, but we do our own review. We do an in-house review. We have colleagues or experts in various aspects which will look critically at the data and form a decision with a document to say that this data is robust or there are weak areas that we need to go back to the applicant and ask them for more information around that. But we certainly do our own analysis. We don't just accept, and that's not being arrogant. We don't accept what is put in front of us. We rework it and make sure that it's consistent with our own brief. Over.
Thank you. We're moving to our last set of questions in the interest of time. And the two questions I have, the first one is from Marc Atkins. He didn't indicate which publication he's representing, but his question is, could you at some point hold a similar briefing around what would be needed for Ivermectin to be approved as a COVID treatment, and perhaps dispel the notion that SAHPRA is blocking it? And then the second question comes from Mandisa. Mandisa also didn't indicate which media house she is representing. Her question is thus: does authorization of a vaccine take into account efficacy of a vaccine against emerging variants of concern like the Beta and the Delta? Those are our last two questions before we wrap up. Over to our speakers.
Thank you. I'll take both questions. Indeed, I mean, we had the last conversation similar to this we had on Ivermectin was in February, and would be happy to have another one, because as we committed, we are reviewing the data as it's available for this product. The latest, there was a publication, I think this week or early now in June, of a study that was conducted in Colombia with about 400 participants. And the study indicated that those who were put on Ivermectin on a 5-day course did not indicate any, better clinical outcomes to those who are on placebo. And so we're happy to have another conversation where we provide the latest data. There's also lately been an advisory out from the NAMLEC. This is the National Essential Medicines List Committee, that have also indicated similarly that ivermectin can only be used, in randomized clinical trials because there is insufficient evidence still that demonstrates its efficacy, but also insufficient evidence that demonstrate that it's not effective. So our compassionate access use program still stands, and we continue to assess every single application for the use of this drug. But we take your recommendation and we will indeed have a conversation on this. The variants of concern, very important question. This is something that for us as a regulator is utmost with these vaccines, considering the prevalence of the Beta variant in our context, that every vaccine needs to demonstrate a satisfactory level of efficacy against this specific variant of concern. And I think, with the scientific community, as they continue to do the genetic sequencing of these variants, whenever there is the new data around other variants, we would need to ensure that our regulatory processes do consider that. So we are constantly assessing and evaluating the status of information available around all of these variants. Thank you, Musili.
Thank you. And this is where we've come to the end of this particular webinar that was focusing on the process of vaccine approval. And let me thank our speakers who time and time again always avail themselves and leave us much more informed in terms of the work that SAHPRA does, but also where we are with the vaccination process. I would also like to thank the team at SAHPRA that makes sure that we always have access to the speakers and our media colleagues who keep joining us in numbers, because at the end of the day, the information that is shared here benefits the broader public, and it's important that we get as much knowledge as possible in dissecting some of these technical terms, so that the layman on the street is also able to understand where we are in as far as the vaccination rollout is concerned and the process involved in approving the vaccine. So from me, Musiri Mokhele, do look forward to many more of these type of webinars that we do have in partnership with SAHPRA. And with those few words, it's a goodbye from me. Thank you to everyone that has joined us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.